We adopt the agenda as presented. Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
We will proceed accordingly. Next on our agenda is the approval of the minutes from the May 1st, 2018 Planning Commission meeting. Did anybody have any additions or adjustments? I'll go ahead and move that we approve the minutes as presented. Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All right. Next on our agenda is the comprehensive plan draft review. Who's going to walk us through this one tonight?
That would be Dave, sitting in the audience.
He volunteers. Scott's volunteered.
So you get to benefit from me walking you through this presentation tonight because Brad was unavailable to be at the meeting tonight, which I am a poor replacement for Brad, but we can get through it. But also here tonight is Rita Trapp from HKGI, so we do have some planning expertise in the house to help us get our way through. As a reminder, you're not being asked to take any action tonight. This is just an opportunity for the Planning Commission to provide input to the process. So questions we can't answer tonight, we'll take down and follow up with Brad. The intent is to make revisions to the draft document based on feedback we've gotten from the steering committee and the Planning Commission and some ongoing review that staff's doing so that we're presenting an updated plan to the City Council for them to release for jurisdictional review, which I think we described to you when we gave you an update about this a month ago. But I bet you my slide says the same thing. Yeah. So the intent is that at the May 29th City Council, we'd be asking the City Council to authorize release of the document for jurisdictional review. That's a mandatory 6-month period to allow agencies near us or above us to review the document. We would expect that during that 6-month period, we'll still be reviewing sections, making possible revisions, potentially convening the steering committee to address any feedback that we're getting along the way. So the draft document that you were provided certainly shouldn't be considered a final version. There'll still be opportunity to work through the document over the next 6 months. Once we've heard back from all of the jurisdictions, and we're hoping to hear back from them early in the 6-month process, and our experience is that everybody else is waiting for their plan to review, so most people do try to honor that and turn those comments around sooner than later versus waiting till the last day. But once we've received all that feedback, prepared a final draft of the document, then a formal public hearing would be held. The intent then would be to submit the plan for approval by Met Council by the end of the year, and then after Met Council says it's good to go, then the City Council would need to approve it. So any questions on that process? Great. So what we're going to do tonight, this is intended to be an opportunity for questions and dialogue and feedback from the Planning Commission. So I'm going to provide a little bit of a recap of the process, but then we're just going to open up the draft plan and make our way through it. Certainly, Dave should feel free to jump in at any point, as well as Scott. You weren't able to be at the last meeting, and you weren't at the last meeting. So we're going to be going through somewhat of a similar process, but not to the level of detail that we went with the steering committee meeting. As I was noting to some of you, the meeting went till 9:30, at which point I started packing everybody's stuff up to kick them out. And then I was here probably for another 10, 15 minutes, and I found a number of them outside still talking about the document. So while it's the only item on the agenda tonight, I don't intend to be long-winded, but certainly looking for input and feedback along the way. So I do think it's just important to recap the process in terms of what level of engagement we've had with both the public and the various committees and commissions. To date, there's been 9 steering committee meetings. I did count them to make sure that number was correct. And those of you who are on the committee know it's a really great, impressive group of individuals. At the last meeting, they did a very deep dive through the plan and had a lot of great feedback and discussion. So certainly a great group of individuals representing a variety of types of landowners and perspectives. There's been joint council, planning commission, park and rec committee meetings in both October and January, and then there's been additional periodic briefings along the way. Then also, just as a reminder, there was an element of outreach to the broader community too, through community surveys, social pinpoint, a booth at Classic Car to start the process off. We did have a public open house in October, another round of community surveys and use of social pinpoint to get feedback on the different alternatives that we were looking at for land use. So it's a fairly external process. We did also, Ben, when he was still here, he and the team met with a number of the affected property owners in the growth areas too, to get some feedback from them along the way. So where we are today is we have an actual document. You all were provided a link to that document, and I believe you were afforded the opportunity to get a printed one. That still is available through Cindy if that's something that you would prefer to have in paper. But what we're going to do is just walk through the document a little bit, maybe highlight a couple of things along the way. But I'm not going to go in detail section by section, but I'm going to kind of stop at each section to see if anybody has an area that they want to bring up any discussion around as we work our way through it. And certainly, if you haven't gotten through the entire document, there continues to be time. So as Brad noted in his memo, any feedback or specific red line edits or comments you want to ship to Brad, that's totally acceptable. Just a couple of things before I open the plan. As a reminder, so the process is working from the Met Council population projections. So the city has given a systems statement that says how many people and jobs and households we should be planning for 2040. So that's a baseline assumption that occurs throughout the entire document and informs many elements of the document. With land use being a core part of the effort to figure out where growth will be accommodated. So the population is increasing, we have to plan for where that growth can be. And of course, figure out how to do it in a way that's logical and so that we can sewer it, so we can flush the toilet. And with the city's orderly annexation agreement that's in place with Laketown Township, that generally the growth is moving both south and west. The southerly direction has been a key priority for planned growth in the city in the nearly 20 years I've worked here. And Doug and I were just chatting about this before the meeting. Part of what was driving that as being the direction we were headed was to move closer to 212 and Highway 10, where we have a better transportation system in place than the overcapacity 5 that until recently, when asked when it would be widened, I would say, when I'm dead. So planning to grow south has always been a priority, but certainly westerly as well, as property owners in that area would look to see their property developed. The land use plan more than accommodates the projected growth. So you may recall Ben talking about whether the population projections were low compared to what we've been seeing as a rate of growth recently. So we wanted to make sure that from a planning perspective, we at least had enough land planned for in the event the market were to change abruptly and we started to see growth happen much more rapidly than what they were anticipating for their numbers. It is a 20-year plan that gets updated every 10 years, so we'll have the pleasure of doing this all again in 10 years, and we'll have a different lens that we're looking through depending on what the market's up to at that point in time. And I'm sure HKGI is counting down the days till they get to do this all again in 10 years.
We're not done yet.
This slide just shows the Met Council population and household projections. So the 2040 Met Council population projection is 15,400. I meant to go back and look today, but I think in our 2030 plan, that number was like 27,000.
Quite a bit higher.
So that's a good indication of how, the reality of the market changes every time we're doing this thing, and we're doing it through the lens of what we know today. The plan also reflects this preferred land use plan. This was the net result of several different alternatives that had been vetted through by the steering committee and members of the public and staff. It's worth noting that the overall residential density meets Met Council target of 3 density units per acre. That has to be the core basis of the plan. So everything we're doing, we have to keep our eye on that lens, and the basis for that 3 units per acre is so that Met Council can efficiently sewer an area. So you wouldn't want to extend, nor would I, big giant sewer pipes to serve 5 houses. There needs to be some density to make that financially affordable, so that's where their 3 units per acre comes from.
With that being your forte, is that pretty much standard metro-wide?
Yeah,
Okay.
yes.
3
Thank you.
units an acre?
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
No?
No, so the Met Council has, sorry.
Perfect.
They have, I believe it's 9 different categories for cities, and each city is, like you have 2. Some cities just have 1, but as you go closer to the urban core, your minimum dwelling units per acre goes up. So the comp plans that I've been working on, Mound, for example, on the other side of Lake Minnetonka, that had 5 dwelling units, and any new growth has to be at least 5 units per acre. Maplewood was another one I worked on, that was at 10 units an acre, so every
Oh, wow.
new development needed to come in at a higher density. So, and then as you go into Minneapolis, St. Paul, St. Louis Park, it rises again.
So
to
this is
even higher.
So what's the floor and what's the ceiling that you're seeing in all these plans you're doing, just out of curiosity?
On dwelling units per acre?
Mm-hmm. What's the lowest and the highest?
Well, 3 is, once you get outside of the sewered area, then it drops, and then we try to not put too much density in so that you can not overtax the land through individual sewer and septic systems. Generally, the plans we're working on are more in the 3 to 10. We do have a few plans that I'm not working on that are in the urban areas, like St. Louis Park, and there, I don't remember their number. It's maybe, I don't want to guess, because I haven't looked at that number, because I haven't had to serve that one. Generally, I'm kind of in the 5 to 10 range of how much I have to plan for. But the biggest thing is to remember that that's new development or redevelopment. So anything that was already identified in the 2030 plan, you get to keep at the densities that they had in the 2030 plan. So for example, Mound was in 3 units an acre 10 years ago. Now we're at 5 units an acre. So everything we planned for last time can stay at 3 units an acre. And it's only our new growth that's to accommodate our 2030 to 2040. Do we have to have it at the new densities?
Excellent, thank you. So although 3
Fascinating.
seems dense to us, it's actually quite low density compared to other communities where you're seeing.
Right, where you have transit investments, or so for example, if you're in Maplewood, they have 2 bus rapid transit, and in those areas we had to plan for at least 25 units an acre. So around transit, because again, it's similar to the sewers. If you're going to make the investments in these fixed route, high capacity types of transit systems, they want to have the dwelling units around it to support it, as well as to make sense of the investments that they're making.
And plus, that type of density uses that transportation all the
Right,
time.
there's that
Go
too.
hand in hand.
Yeah, they do go hand in
It's
hand.
vertical density more than horizontal.
Yes,
Yep.
and so that's what we kind of plan, more mixed use, higher densities, taller buildings, all of those things.
Excellent, thank you.
Fantastic.
So
Who
does,
knew?
does part of
The cities I work in, they're all growing cities, so they're all
does part of
blessed
your
with the 3 units per acre.
Yes,
does part of your answer to that number relate to how we're classified? For example, the emerging suburban edge.
correct.
So
That's when I was referencing.
so that's the classification that's given to us by, is it Met Council
Yes.
that designates that?
Yes, Met Council at the beginning, as part of Thrive MSP, before we started all of this comp plan fund, created what they classified as the different classifications. And it's urban, so served classifications, and rural, so the unserved. And then they divide all of the cities and portion up the cities into those different designations, and that's what dictates your density. So, for example, Maplewood that I was referencing, I do those because those are the ones I did, so they're fresh. Maplewood is considered an urban community, but not an urban core or an urban center community, so they differentiated between St. Paul, Minneapolis, and that's why we're one step out of having to do that density. And then Mound, I think, was a suburban community, and so that's why it has to go at a higher. And what they do is they look at the amount of development that you've had, so how much land is left for you, how much have you already developed, kind of when you developed, and how you've developed. So for example, St. Louis Park is much more, in most areas, is more of a grid system, more traditional to the Minneapolis and St. Paul. Richfield is kind of that grid street system, so that's why they're more of the urban core, urban center, than like a Maplewood that has a mix of that, kind of near St. Paul, but then as you move out, it's more suburban looking, cul-de-sacs and streets, and so that's why they kind of flip into the next density category.
Yeah, follow-up question, if you don't mind. No, so I think you made a comment earlier that anything that's currently in the current plan as far as density carries forward.
Yes.
So if we're planning pretty much all of our usable land moving forward, not quite all of it, but a bunch of it, so anything that's currently mapped out, we maintain that 3 units per acre, or could that change moving forward?
It will depend on how we classify it when we go to the Met Council. So every 10 years when you do it, you have to identify which land was already planned for the last time and what you need newly developed as part to meet your requirements from 2030 to 2040, or to meet your affordable housing requirements from 2021 to 2030.
Got it.
And so what we do is we don't necessarily put this detail in the plan, but we have for all of our plans the background spreadsheets that explain exactly parcel by parcel when we thought that particular parcel would develop, and that's what you use to determine whether or not it qualifies at which densities.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so that takes us to the plan itself. And so the plan is bookmarked, which, if you didn't notice that, is worth noting, which makes it somewhat handy to navigate your way through it if you have reviewed it electronically. I did just want to note that we are aware that the acknowledgement page is in need of updating. We missed a bunch of steering committee members, so that wasn't on purpose. But
I thought I was fired.
they didn't pick and choose which ones were not
This
wanting
one
credit.
meeting.
You just don't get paid.
But the first section's the community context section, which is just a whole bunch of pages with background on the city, which I'll note that Doug seemed to really appreciate reading and learning some more background about the city. I don't know that I have anything necessarily to comment on this section, Rita, unless you think there's anything worth saying. But if anybody has any questions or comments about it, it was an
Great.
interesting read.
I love this stuff. I'm a dork.
So just a whole lot of background in that section. Then the next one is the vision and guiding principles. So really setting the stage for the plan. As a reminder, there was input gathered through the first community survey and discussions with stakeholders and steering committee, which contributed to the development of the vision statement and guiding principles. I will note that the steering committee spent, I would say, a fair amount of time talking about this section and discussing whether it really reflected Victoria enough and really set aside what makes Victoria Victoria. Would you add anything to that, Scott, in terms of how I've summarized that briefly?
I'd say that's accurate. It's difficult to put it all in there without maybe sounding too homey or, it's.
And wanting to make sure that one steering committee member commented, when you look at the guiding principles, does this say Victoria? And what's missing from it, from really capturing what makes Victoria special and important? So one of the things that was identified through the discussion was a need to add a principle that's focused more on and natural resources, since that is such a huge, it's such a huge part of our character and what sets us apart, all the wetlands and tree preservation and everything that exists within the community. So,
This was, I mean, we spent a lot of time on this, I remember the last meeting, because I forget who brought it up, but to some point, it might be sort of the nature of the beast, but it's like, okay, Chanhassen could say this, or Waconia could say this, and it might be somewhat just the nature of the beast. We're all trying to do these things, and so that was the struggle. Okay, how do we tie this in to Victoria? What makes us different from Chaska, Chanhassen, Waconia?
I feel like I'm a little confused about what the intent of the guiding principles. I mean, when I read the guiding principles, it seems like it's just stating what the intent of this report is doing, as opposed, right? I mean, it's orienting the community to the future. It's serve as a tool for evaluation of proposals. I mean, that's how it reads to me. I'm not sure if that's the intent.
Of the guide, so what you just read was the explanation of what guiding principles are.
Right.
The next page is where they actually start. And they're meant as a foundation and also something you can point back to. So when you have, 5 years from now, you have something and you wonder or not, and it wasn't covered in the comprehensive plan, you go back to these elements and the vision and say, does whatever it is that we want to do still meet the intent of these guiding principles or not? And if it doesn't, then it probably means you shouldn't be doing that, or you need to change your underlying vision and guiding principles. So I can
Right.
give an example if that would be helpful of how I could see this being used, if that would help. We just have a comp plan that is getting somewhat controversial now in a town. And so their vision was that they're gonna be a great place to live and they wanna have, single-family residential and they really want commercial and industrial. And all of a sudden, now that there's a new development project, they don't want any development in town. But that is in stark contrast to the idea that we want a thriving downtown district, because we can't get a thriving downtown district if we don't have rooftops in town to serve that downtown district. So staff is going back to them and saying, you can do that, but we need to change your vision and guiding principles, because what you said you wanted was a thriving downtown, all of these other elements, and this we need in order to do that. So if that's not gonna work, then we need to go back and change our vision and guiding principles, which you can do, but you need to understand kind of how they get linked together. So these should be kind of the foundation for how the land use policies and actions and what you're doing. And they're just kind of broad. And
Yeah.
so, did that help? I don't know if that helped.
Yeah, that's good. I think I was reacting when you were talking about guiding principles that you had the first page up as opposed to the next two pages, which
Right, that's what I was wondering.
which actually outline it. So yeah, because these are intentionally generic, talking about what they're for, right? And then there's the next two pages that are intended to be the specifics.
so I do think that the question that Brad had was the same for this group, of whether, if you feel like it doesn't accurately reflect the community, or you see anything missing, that would be important feedback to share.
I wonder if the missing element may be some specifics, right? So just take an example, like excellent trails, parks, and recreational opportunities. When you read that, aside from stating that starting with the word Victoria and ending with City of Lakes and Parks, that paragraph could apply to any community. But if there are already, some key examples of either key parks, that are stated as a foundation to be built upon or linked, for example, that might, using that example and applying it to some of these other categories, I think may personalize it and strengthen it, sort of acknowledging what's there and what you're building off, or what's your commitment to that you're trying to outline.
So like stating a specific project or specific park or amenity, that labeling that or using that in that paragraph
Right, like,
to help pinpoint the idea?
making reference to some specific key trails that exist.
Or the new.
As a foundation for the network to go down, or, yeah,
New
some,
park in Wasserman and.
right. Yeah, I don't think it's listing all of them, but I think adding some personalization for the community, because there's probably something in the community with each one of these categories that we're either building off of or aspiring to accomplish that's more personal than just sort of an overarching aspirational goal that could apply just about anywhere.
Yeah, I think the second change he talked about making from the steering committee seems to be right along that line. And what his memo says is strengthening references to key identity elements of downtown and natural resources and more unique assets. So that reads somewhat similar to me of, you know, trying to differentiate a little bit more with some of the language.
I don't remember us talking about it specifically, but when Jeff brings that up, I mean, when you think about, you know, the park system just immediately to the north of us, and you think about the Arboretum, you know, just to our east, I mean, two huge, I mean, those are landmark park system, well, not park, I mean, and they're not moving, and we're not moving. That would be one of those things that could kind of set us, Victoria, apart if it was maybe mentioned.
Yeah, you think of Carver Park Reserve and you go back to the land use map and the fact that it's taking up
Yeah.
that much of the
It's kind of
property.
sticking right out at us.
Perhaps there should be an addition to chapter number 2, community context, because they seem to elaborate more. It's not just generic there. And then we could list, we could talk about those tremendous assets. There is nothing in there about that.
Are you saying that there's no discussion of the parks in the community context?
Isn't there?
Is that what?
Yeah,
I'm thinking
the
that,
amenities.
Yeah, sometimes, we put that kind of foundational information in each chapter so that someone doesn't have to go back to that second chapter as they're reviewing parks. So for example, existing conditions for parks is in the parks chapter rather than having it in chapter 2. We can certainly mention that, but just as a foundation of how kind of things go. The chapter 2 is generally just kind of the demographics, employment, kind of the numbers part of it. And then we want to make sure that if you pick up the parks chapter or you pick up the housing chapter, that all the data you need to understand it is in that chapter. And so it's not repeated twice.
I think,
But
I think it still would be a good idea to put a reference to that in the beginning for someone who wants to read the book from the beginning instead of the last chapter
Okay.
first.
So add a reference to the fact that additional information is available in other chapters.
Or maybe acreage.
Yep.
How many acres are we with parks?
And open
What
space.
percent of our community is that? And
Yep.
that might be good.
It's a big number.
Well, then that's very unusual.
It's like almost 30%, right?
Yeah.
I remember seeing it on one of these
23%.
charts.
It's in one of these, it's in that table 4.1 existing land use. Page, what, like 30, I think it is.
That's,
So my one comment, just to keep in mind as you review this, the guiding principles, is to know that it's the combination of all those guiding principles together that makes it unique for you, not individual elements. So it's true, you can pick out the parks and say, well, that could be about everybody, but it really is all the combination, because I certainly work in towns where there is no economic and fiscal strength, really. There's like a tiny little downtown, and that's it. So they don't have the same elements all the way through. So we certainly can add stuff and we'll pass that message along, but also, as you think about it, think about the fact that it's all of those elements together that makes you unique, as opposed to one individual element shining on its own that says, well, this clearly is Victoria here. Because you need all of those things to make it sing about who you are as a community.
I know when I look at this, that's probably my biggest, I forget, this is the 100,000-foot view. You know, you just kind of drill down on these individual sections and you gotta take a step back and say, no, wait a minute, this is
Right.
bigger.
When I can give, as I read these, I'm like, I can give examples. I have a town that has no multimodal transportation. I have another town that has no industrial. You know, and so that's where I can see the differences, but that's the advantage I have, working in other places. When you're in the town, you wanna make sure it shines. So I think those are good things to call out. How else can we highlight those things?
Move on to land use.
One quick last question. So you said there was some other feedback about the environment or sustainability. Is that picking up aspects of the lakes?
The natural environment, so lakes, wetlands, tree preservation, when you reflect on the fact that the way we've developed and our commitment to making sure that wetlands, wetland buffers, historically significant groves of trees are protected through the development process and placed in outlots that are deeded to the city, that's fairly unique. That creates, particularly with the amount of wetland we have here, it really creates a unique protection of the natural environment, partly because that's the environment that exists, but the city has long been committed to that. Long before low-impact development was a term that was used, the city was already seeking to do that. So it felt to the steering committee that commitment to the natural environment was just was missing in those guiding principles.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay. Land use. I feel like I should just, throw Rita to the wolves and let her start talking. This is quite a chapter. I mean, and it really is the meat of the whole plan. So I think maybe we probably spent more time talking about this section. We probably spent an hour and a half, I would say, on this section with the steering committee, talking about anything from the conservation, residential land use category down to the density requirements. So we're probably open to taking this discussion to any direction of any questions that anybody had. The chapter lays out some historical information with existing land use, and then of course projected land use and what those different land use categories mean. The conservation residential land use designation was placed in different areas around the Marsh Lake Hunt Club as its own land use designation, and the group ended up spending quite a bit of time talking about whether that should be its own land use designation or more of an overlay district, which I won't have the ability to describe what an overlay district technically means compared to a land use designation. But Brad felt that it would be a better way to accomplish the goals of really wanting to see something unique happen in these areas that have really unique topography and trees. The way I would describe it would be, we have our typical zoning districts that we're now using and applying when subdivisions come in. This would be likely the more area that you would want to see a PUD come in, where you're coming up with some trade-offs for density and additional protection of groves of trees, other unique amenities and open space.
If you want, I can talk more about an overlay
Yes.
district. Okay, I wasn't sure. And Brad told me a little bit about what the plan is. So the idea was, I believe, we are also doing some work with the watershed district on the south, and kind of where the conservation district is looking at. And so the idea of creating a conservation district is the notion that an overlay district would be, you kind of designate an area, and within there you put in parameters or design guidelines and allow people to move density and move where the development occurs to protect certain areas. So it could be bluffs, wooded areas, wetlands, low-quality, high-quality wetlands. And I know as part of that work, they're exploring the ideas of, can you do integrated stormwater management plan, stormwater management as opposed to doing little ponding in each subdivision, you do something a little bit broader scale. So the overlay district has been used, and it's something that's a tool that planners use frequently to kind of protect certain areas and allow by right a little bit more than always requiring the plan unit development, which you could do also, but might allow us to do some of that moving around without having to go through as much negotiation and as much work. So it kind of outlined how you do it, what the trade-offs are, what you would get, what areas are we trying to protect, how far setback would you need to be, all of those elements.
More of a PUD approach?
It could be, I don't know what their plan is. You might be able to do it by right also, so that, you lay all of these things out, and as long as they meet those conditions, it can continue to move forward, but it only occurs in the area that you've identified as the overlay district.
So how is that different from conservation residential district? Because I thought that was accomplishing the same thing. I guess I'm not understanding the nuance between
How I
them.
understood it is later on in, I believe it's in the Parks chapter, we don't have to go to it, there's the notion of a green ribbon or a green corridor, and so a conservation, this overlay district may be applied more broadly than just in that little area around that lake, and so it's something that can be available for a broader area of the community where development is happening and can allow connectivity between those different areas instead of just looking at that one area where conservation residential used to be occurring. So that's kind of what they've been talking about, is the notion of adding a policy to encourage the preservation of open space, and so that's kind of linked together of creating an overlay. An example that I can think of off the top of my head, in Chanhassen, they have the Bluff Creek Overlay District, which is in the southern end of the community, kind of where the river, they've had that for 15, 20 years. And the idea there is, again, the protection of the bluffs and allowing development to occur where it's best suited. I mean, it's an overlay district that covers a wide swath of area where the lands have been designated as having those environmental conditions.
So you're suggesting that compared to where previously the conservation residential district was outlined, we're now suggesting that there's an overlay district that actually applies to much broader areas than just that?
That's my understanding, is that the idea was
To
that-
be determined.
that there's a policy that would allow them to evaluate where it should go.
So what we're finding through the work that we're doing with the watershed district on the west growth area is, and what I shared with the steering committee at the last meeting is we'd like to use the steering committee to review and vet that work that the city's doing with the watershed district. So probably looking at having another steering committee meeting in June, which I'm sure everybody loves that idea since it'll be summer. But you'll be given an opportunity to see, really looking at developing that property through 3 different lenses. So one, if the property, all the west growth area was developed through regulations that exist today, what level of environmental protection would that result in? If everything just came in its own little land and went through the platting process and was an R2 zoning district, I think we're using for uniformity, and then applying a look at a lens if you, from an environmental perspective, wanted to protect everything out there, restore wetlands that were degraded, sort of this green print, what does that look like? And then coming through what's really a more realistic preferred way to see development potentially occur. So the stormwater pond example is a great one. So figuring out if there's a way that we can regionalize stormwater in that area versus these stupid little stormwater ponds that we get with each and every development would be something that the city would be interested in participating in. So Brad saw the conservation designation and also is seeing the work that's coming up in the west area, and his brain triggered thinking there may be a better way to accomplish what we're looking for than this precise drawn on a line conservation district. Those of you who were around in that discussion, it probably would be worthwhile to have that conversation with Brad. Those of you that were here when Ben laid out the conservation district, just to make sure there's some continuity between what the steering committee was discussing and where we are today. Feels like a little bit of a gap for me there with Ben gone, since I wasn't a part of any of those discussions early on.
And with our last meeting with Brad, and if I may, Dave, I mean, you're a landowner in there too, so I know, please share your comments. But this overlay, it helped Brad with the numbers too, I think. I mean, that was the
Correct.
bottom line of it, because the density would change a little bit, and it helped Victoria overall meet our match.
So the way the conservation residential district was proposed, it had a density range of 1 unit on 3 acres to 2.25 dwelling units per acre, so quite a bit lower than anything we've seen. And it isn't clear to me why it was drafted that way, as being that low, but if the density is truly that low, it becomes problematic for the city to serve with utilities as well, but the intent was to serve it with utilities. So what Brad would envision is this section just becomes guided the same as the single-family residential, so has the same 2 units per acre up to whatever our top is currently in that range. But then you would put the overlay district over the top of it to make sure that you were still preserving those amenities. So you might see a little higher density in one pocket and a lower density in another pocket, but overall, you'd be still meeting the single-family density.
Right, and that's kind of the basis of the conservation subdivision. Pack the houses together and keep as much green space as you can. That way even utilities, infrastructure, and everything else is cheaper to plumb there
Right.
to get to that certain area with saving the amenity. But saying that too, and I'm thinking of landowners, how does that affect the landowner when we impose an overlay district on top of them? Maybe they had a different concept for their own land. They have 200 acres and had an idea how to develop it. All of a sudden we say, no, you can't do that. You know what I mean? They're going, wait a minute, this is my land.
Well, but
You know,
that's the
within
fundamental,
reason.
but that's the fundamental premise of planning, right? Beyond the interest of the individual and for the good of the broader community, right?
And with that being said, but to restrict someone who bought the land maybe 10 years, 15 years ago when our comprehensive plan said, yep, that's going to be R1. And then all of a sudden we say, no, it's not. It's going to be, you know what I mean? We're progressive in that way, I understand, but we're also restrictive. It could be. I'm just my thought on it.
Yeah.
I just
Dave,
want
you
to
got some
clarify one thing. Wasn't Brad going to reclassify it to low, single-family and change the density lower to like 1 or something? I
So-
thought he was
We
reclassifying
were
that whole thing.
talking about taking, right now as the plan's drafted, the low end of the single-family residential, the low-density residential is 2.25 to 6. With some of the other changes in density numbers that the steering committee talked about and that Brad and I talked about, we'd look at bringing this 2.25 down to 2. Right now, it's 1.9 to 5.9. I wasn't comfortable, frankly, being at 2.25 because we still have developments that come in that are, closer to that 2 range. And I don't know that we wouldn't want to still have the ability to do that within the whole picture. So what he's talking about is the land that was shown as having the conservation residential district, instead of being 0.33 to 2.25, would go up to being 2 to 6, but then we'd have this overlay language. And he was still figuring out how he would recommend that we do that, but it's a key area.
One other thing too about your green belt or whatever, we were talking about that, and you're saying about for animal movement, compared to that rural conservation, you could get down to like a 50-foot path alongside there, and you need like 100 feet for animals or 150 feet. That way they felt, we can do a little bit more variation to make the thing work out a little better for everybody,
Okay.
I think, so.
And I don't think that 0.33 is so restrictive when you start thinking townhomes or something as buffer homes leading into single family and one of these conservation subdivision type things. If that's what your goal is to get it packed in with townhomes. A lot of people that's their move now, multi-level or townhomes packed in. You're going to see that density of 0.33 easily. And that's one of the greatest way to save a green space too. If you had 10 acres and wanted to keep a bunch of it green, would be to have that type of development or housing option.
But just to clarify, the .33 dwelling units per acre would be about one house for every 3 acres.
That's one for three, that's the opposite.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to make sure.
Yep.
All right,
I
sorry.
always have that issue.
I was thinking 3 for 1.
No, I know, that's why I wanted to bring it up, because it always is
All right.
like you have to
Yeah,
pause
so-
for a second and read what it says. So-
Just reverse everything I just said.
Yeah. So by going-
Those big houses.
by going to the 2 to 6, then you're doing,
Yes.
half acre lots,
Yeah,
up
my
to
mistake,
6, which
yep.
is more in the townhomes. So the going to that low density kind of achieves what we
Yeah,
were talking about.
gotcha. Yep.
No, I have the same problem. Every time we talk about anything under an acre, I have to really think.
And I think a lot of this is also based on net usable land as well, so we're subtracting out a lot of stuff, so the density actually might appear to be greater than what it really is because of the net usable land.
So I guess the biggest message for me is even in the overlay districts, it's a similar concept to the conservation of clustering and trying to move people outside of those, whatever the areas are, and however those get designated. So it's kind of the same idea, but not necessarily limited to just this one little area. It would be a concept that could be applied on a wider basis and have more impact to implement other parts of your plan. The green ribbon concept, those kind of areas.
Well, and when I think back, I think it's probably worth, if the computer will work, showing what can be accomplished through that type of approach that created some of our historically unique neighborhoods that are pretty special to Victoria. So the area around Holy Family was master planned and developed, late 90s, early 2000s, somewhere in there. And what the staff at the time was able to accomplish was a variety of housing types, but then also some preservation of pretty significant stands of trees. So this whole woods area behind Allegheny Grove was preserved through a PUD. And, you look at the Lennar project that we were dealing with most recently, where they were removing 70% of the trees. But how that was accomplished was by allowing smaller lots, higher density in this location. These lots are still smaller compared to what you see over in the woodlands. Those lots are a little bit bigger, and all of that was planned together and seeking to accomplish still preserving some special amenities. The other area that I consider to be fairly unique and significant is Watermark. So this area along Kelzer Pond Drive, we were able to avoid having these lots all the way running along the street, but rather preserved all of these trees as open space that was deeded to the city. And I think the intent is to make sure that we still have the opportunity to accomplish that in the areas that warrant accomplishing that, where there is something unique and special that's worth being preserved above and beyond what would happen just through regular regulation. And in doing that west area growth, we found that the areas identified in the plan, which had historically been known to be planned for this conservation development, that we really wanted to have the ability to potentially do that in some other unique areas. But I am a little concerned that Brad and I are working on it right now, and you and Ben were working on that section before, so just want to make sure that we aren't losing something that was historically significant. And Brad did reach out to Ben too to chat with him about it, so I think they had coffee. So Brad's taking, when it goes back to city council, he'll have taken a crack at revising some language around that and certainly as we then go through the review process, if we don't feel like that's accomplished what our intent was, then certainly can revisit that.
I'll be interested to see kind of where he ends up with that in terms of the process, but I feel like everybody's on the same page in terms of the aspirational goals for what the intention of this area is, which is, recognizing its change in topography, the woodlands and the wetlands, and trying to create a framework which minimizes the likelihood of just clear cutting and platting, being the path of least resistance, right? So even when we talk about this option for an overlay district, I'm hopeful that the spirit of that isn't still leaning towards the path of least resistance being what the main district is, which is R1, R2, clear cut it, plat it, be done with it. Because I felt like preserving aspects of the community and the natural resources as exists is where this whole conversation started.
Yep.
So.
I will note too that we did discuss there at some point being a need to realize that there may need to be a financial investment in order to secure some of those things. It can't always be so simple as the landowner just essentially donating their land that's been their investment for 100+ years. So in the case of the West Growth area, what the Watershed District is talking about is leveraging their financial resources in that area, because 6 miles of focal geography for them, that they might be able to bring some financial resources to the table to help it be viable for those landowners to see some of those broader areas preserved. They had historically talked about doing that in the past, but it was always happening, they were always coming to the table way too late, where with them participating and bringing technical expertise and financial resources to the planning process this early, we do have a really unique opportunity to create a framework for doing some special things in that area that I think will help accomplish what that vision is in a way that's actually doable.
If I owned some of that light green land and wanted to have it developed and was asked to give a certain amount of the land to the city, would I have a tax break? No, I'm not talking about real estate tax, but like a good tax deduction?
I'm not aware of any that occurs through the development process. We take a fair amount of land through the development process, whether it's through parks and stormwater ponds and sites for new wells and water towers.
But part of the idea of clustering is the notion that you get the same,
Yeah, the land,
You know,
total land use,
the
yeah.
total number of units is
Right.
the same, you're just putting it on a smaller amount of land and the rest of the land. So you're getting the same value out, because you're getting that many units out of it, but that you're not needing the land to do that, to create that value.
Just the town I came from had a conservation trust,
Yes, and those can exist, yes.
and we don't have anything like that here.
No.
I'm aware of. You can do, and there's,
But I think you could donate land to the city that would be income tax deductible, and that's what
It would be, as equal to if we gave it to a conservation trust. 501c3 type thing. Okay.
The one thing that we talked about too was, like this transfer of density, you have to have a market for it too. And it's not necessarily beneficial to the landowner, to put it more density if there's not a market for it.
Good point.
So, everybody's got that conception, so just want to clarify that.
If you build it, they'll come, not necessarily.
No, not anymore. People are pretty specific. I'm a builder, I'm a customer
Oh,
builder,
okay.
so.
And the other interesting thing about market-driven development is that that's the benefit of a long-term plan, so that even, if portions of the plan are designated for higher or lower density, and you want to sell your land, but it just doesn't happen to coincide with the market demand this year, well, it just might not be time to develop that property necessarily, right? And market will come at some point in time, and things will fall into place and align with the plan, but we don't necessarily keep switching and moving our land use plan around to accommodate, an individual landowner's wish to develop it totally different because that's the market this year. It just might, the timing is dictated by the marketplace, right?
Right. And the thing is, today's market is completely different. I've done developments over the years, smaller ones, 30 lots, Back, 15, 20 years ago, you had to do 100-foot lots. Now, because of the price and all the fees associated, I'm paying $20,000 for a building permit today compared to 15 years ago was, $12,000. Just everything has gotten so expensive. And people don't want the large yards anymore. They want smaller ones, but they don't want to be cramped either, They still want to have some yard to, for the kids to play or whatever, so.
We also talked about changing the, increasing the high-density minimums in commercial nodes and downtown to a minimum that's more realistic in the marketplace. The draft that's in here, that's 12, isn't actually something we would expect to see in these areas. So the group talked through that a bit and is suggesting increasing those up. I'm gonna find the. So in the downtown mixed use, instead of having 12 dwelling units per acre, we talked about increasing that quite a bit. Because when you look at downtown, we wouldn't anticipate seeing townhomes in downtown. For housing, we'd be talking stacked, not, yeah, and that one's, why don't I remember this number?
60?
It was like 80,
Is that the Beard one?
yeah,
He told me 60.
okay.
I can't do anything other than what Brad told me. Good preparation.
I'm so glad he told me.
Well, that's 60.
60 units per acre.
We were debating, it's around there.
Yeah, a whole lot of units per acre. So when you think about what 12 units per acre would look like, that didn't seem aligned with what any of us had heard talked about being part of the vision for housing in downtown. So, for example, on the 13 and a half acres, a senior housing stacked building on the lake as opposed to 5 townhomes.
You've got the
Lined up.
example out the window here, look left and look right. You probably got your 12 to the left and your higher density to the right with Cal's project.
So that there seemed to be a bunch of head nods around the table. The section also talks about downtown. The only other topic that really came up from the steering committee was removing references to parking deck solutions for downtown parking. There seems to be a fair amount of controversy in the community right now surrounding building of parking decks. So the language is being modified to say a downtown vision plan refers to parking solutions that fit the character of downtown and don't preclude what the parking solution is when we're just about to undertake a parking study that's supposed to help us figure out what the right parking solution is.
Carrie, you make mention of the downtown vision plan. Did I see a comment that the subject was resurfaced about extending the CBD south of Highway 5 again?
Yeah, so that didn't come up per se extensively at the steering committee level that I recall. The other two of you could correct me if I'm wrong. But Brad's been meeting with council members too on the draft plan. So it sounds like he's gotten some feedback about wanting to at least talk about that some more. So that strikes me as something that probably will get talked about during that 6-month period. But the way I read his note, and Doug, I think you were at those meetings, it was going south along 11 towards like the church, right?
Mm-hmm.
They were
That as
talking
well.
about maybe repurposing some of the houses even into office office, like a law office or something like that.
As you moved south of downtown, which was slightly different than the conversation that I recall the steering committee having about jumping commercial across Highway 5, you know, along the length of downtown. So I would imagine that that would likely be something the steering committee would want to crack at discussing before it necessarily got changed, but I might just be guessing.
Other thoughts on that, since it seems to be a new topic?
I don't think to me, it's always been the elephant in the room, because Highway 5 is it's gonna be 4 lanes. And it might be, the way that Carver, and Kara, you explained this last time too, the way that Carver County works now with that new wheelage tax, I mean, money could come up and that could move sooner. And we probably need a plan for that, because it could happen way before you die.
Right.
Way, way, way.
Yeah, I mean, the answer is very different now than it was before that wheelage tax was passed. The prioritization for 5 is east to west. So the segment from Rolling Acres Road to 41 is the first priority. If any of you have the pleasure of driving that during rush hour, it's backed up from 41 to Rolling Acres Road on many a day. And so the county is talking about initiating a plan to do a corridor study. That's not the right word. It's a mini transportation study that's actually going to look at 5 from Rolling Acres Road to 41, Rolling Acres Road from 5 to 7, as well as 82nd Street behind the Arboretum from Bavaria to 41, because they all interrelate. They all connect with each other. If you make improvements to one, you're going to impact another. The county's perspective is that when Highway 5 gets widened through that segment, it would be better to have 82nd Street completed first, so that when you close 5, you have a viable alternative. That's a lot closer than going down to 10 or going up to 7. But, you know, it's complicated because there's local dollars that have to fund all of that. So that part of it is probably what's going to be the focus for the first 10 years of this comprehensive plan. But the second 10 years isn't really all that far off. And what Brad was hearing from the group was concern about, so 5 needs to be widened to handle additional capacity, but we don't want to ruin the walkability, pedestrian-friendly, the connectedness between both sides. So, as an example, in the implementation plan, we could have a plan to prepare a plan that looks at how you could widen 5 in a way that preserves that character and creates that ability to get across the road. And what I kept hearing the committee talk about over the last few months on this topic was just not knowing. What does south of 5 look like when you don't know what 5's going to look like?
I like your comment, Kara, about having a plan for the plan. If you look at our westerly communities, Cologne being one of them, Northern America being one of them, split by the highway, the safety issues, the commerce issues going back and forth, it just doesn't work. As a first responder years ago, I actually had the privilege, good or bad, to attend a scene of many scenes, kids and people traveling back and forth to communities across 212. It just doesn't work. But it would be, using your comment, having a plan to address that. There's got to be some sort of substance we can use saying if Highway 5 gets X wide, we could, whether it's overpasses, tunnels underneath, how do we deal with that? If we continue our commercial district south of 5 along the whole corridor, how much infrastructure are we putting in that may be torn out? How does it impact the County 11 going south? Just trying to save redundancy and tearing out stuff we just did. I'm working with a developer right now down in Shakopee, and cities are requiring the group to basically tear out a road that we just put in 2 years ago to accommodate whatever, which makes no sense to the group, but it is what we're fighting at this particular moment.
Isn't it already downtown over by Holiday and Victoria Ottawa? It's already there. Why would it be different where those houses were than it is, because it's already considered downtown anyway?
Well, but you don't have, yeah, yes, there's a gas station over there, but that's not that type of thing that you're walking to. You know, it's the food and beverage and it's the retail. It's those kind of core services that are central business district that you want to be able to walk to freely, as opposed,
But it already is considered downtown there. That's the way I understood it.
CBD, yeah. The cigar shop also, they hops CBD across the road when
It
they
runs
develop
all the way down to where
that. To the west, yeah.
Yeah, so it already is considered. I don't understand why that's an issue, because, or at least the way that I understand it, those parts, south of 5 is already considered that.
I got a lot of that development's done by CUP, I'm guessing, versus by right. I think Carrie made a comment earlier that we may at some point have to invest in some infrastructure as a city to preserve some of this stuff. If we as a community had to buy a single-family dwelling for $200,000 for that quarter-acre, third-of-acre lot, it's gonna be a whole lot different than buying a ongoing concern business that's valued at 1.2 or 1 point something. The numbers get much more dramatic if we're tearing out future ongoing businesses that maybe close that gap that we may have to open up someday. Maybe it's a state issue, not a city issue, if the state decides to widen the highway, I don't know.
So-
Just to make sure I'm understanding, are we talking about the going down on County Road 11?
So
'Cause I feel like we're talking on two different things.
There has been
We
two
are.
different topics that have come out.
Okay, good.
So
As far as the community.
You're on it,
now,
Rita.
yeah.
You got this.
I'm like,
So
now I'm confused.
the steering committee, and we solicited public feedback through the survey, and at the open houses discussed jumping the central business district to the south side of 5 all the way along here, like all the way out to the fire station
Okay.
and back through. And the consensus was that there was too much uncertainty around 5 for anybody to really express consensus that, yes, we should do that now in this 2040 comprehensive plan. But now what's come up with council members is extending it down 11 towards the church. So it'd be interesting to see if you all have any reaction to that.
But one of the things that he
Concept.
put in here that I wanted to circle back on is, at least just reading this, what I understood, is that that's allowing the conversion of those houses into commercial businesses. So it's not necessarily tearing down, but that you allow the organic conversion of those, so that once the traffic and the movement becomes too much in that area, that people don't really wanna live there, and there's interest in putting in a business in that same thing, that you're allowing that conversion to happen.
That's what I heard.
That's what I'm reading.
That's what I
how
understood
understood
too.
it.
And that's what
that
they did,
happens.
that's what they did with the first property.
Yep, and that
That's exactly what they
using
did.
that application works really, really well. In the open market, if we were to call that a business district, a commercial district, and hypothetically saying one of those parties wanted to sell to another residential use, but the residential use is now slated commercial, they just lost their financing.
It
So
depends
it's
on
how
how
it's
you
worded.
do it, though.
Correct, exactly how it's worded, how it's presented.
Correct, because there are times that you can do that and you allow either use to happen,
Mhm.
and you don't regulate it to say that it has to be one or the other.
Exactly.
But, what I understand this to say is the notion of that you're starting to allow that kind of organic marketplace conversion along that street to start to happen, recognizing that traffic and other issues may get busy enough that people aren't gonna wanna live in those.
And my thought on that too is, why don't we finish developing downtown, north of 5 first? You have a bunch of empty lots, empty spots, and no parking. I think our comp plan should be realistic and figure, let's finish the north side and that 13 acres we've been trying to peddle for 20 years now. I mean, let's leave the residents alone, leave them out of the business district for now, and let it finish what's supposed to be finished. We have an unfinished project downtown here, and I think looking forward, that's the idea. That was the idea of some of the meetings we had where our concept plan for downtown was to keep it on that side of the downtown so everything was connected. That was the huge discussion with residents and everybody, that they thought it'd be better if we didn't have to go back and forth across 5 to hit different businesses. That if we just went across once at the crosswalk or a tunnel, then we're over on that side, on the lakeside, where we could gather as a downtown. That was the thought on it. And I'll tell you, every single neighbor along that Highway 5 there, I know all of them. I've been here 28 years, and they all realize that Highway 5 is going to get bigger sooner or later. And they're not going to tear businesses down. They're going to tear houses down or convert houses to businesses. They're realistic that way. And they're bigger lots, so that's easy to do, and there's even parking you could add to those residences. So, I mean, reality-wise, they understand that, but I still think you finish what you've started on this side of the road first as a goal.
Todd made great comments. I think tying into with some of the comments Rita made, I think makes sense that we're open to it, just not doing direct zoning to the area. So it's in there for conversation, but I agree with Todd. We need to keep our business district where the business district is today. And tying into Kara's comments, it's hard to forecast on something in the big unknown, like we dealt with the Marsh Lake. That will be developed someday, but we have no idea what that road's going to look like, so it's hard to say yay or nay on something that, on speculation.
And if there is an interest in something business-wise, we dealt it with it on an individual basis before. We could probably handle that again. I don't see all of a sudden 6 people selling their residences because the hair salon, everything wants to move in on that County Road 11 or along 5 for that matter. I see it more of a spot thing at this time. And you can deal with it like we did before by changing the zoning if the use is going to change.
I mean, we say Highway 5 is an unknown, but I don't understand why we say it's an unknown, because whether it expands the number of lanes or not, it's inherently incompatible with this notion of a pedestrian-friendly downtown core as it exists today. And traffic is only going to increase over time. I mean, that's a reasonable assumption, right? And so when we think about where the energy has been focused in recent history in terms of what the downtown vision looks like, but also just that incompatible idea of, I'm just a little confused why we're sort of distracting ourselves with encouraging development south of 5 when there's so much left to be done north of 5. That when I think about the timeline that we're talking about, seems like that's the appropriate focus. It seems like it's at odds with each other to think that traffic on 5 will continue and we sort of encourage or open up development south of 5, and we'll all wake up someday and wonder, why the hell do we always got, why are we walking across 5? Why are we hopping in our car and driving across 5? Why is downtown, there's some inherent challenges that come with that you can kind of see it will come.
If it's not designed as a central business now, then it would be a parking play, right? Because that's where the only place where you can get parking registered to the CBU would be to where those houses are.
I haven't heard of any talk of parking south of 5.
If it's going to be developed, it's something that we talk about it every time we talk about anything down there.
But we'd park south of 5 and then we'd walk across Highway 5 to get to all
just
the
saying
get to the amenities and
if
businesses.
it gets reclassified as central business, then parking would open up there too, right?
It possibly could if businesses moved in there.
Right.
I don't see anyone promoting parking across there to go across to the north side of 5.
If they put in law offices or whatever down 11, then
Yes.
then it does come there, and then it becomes a factor, and it blows out wider that way. Sorry.
Can I make a comment?
Absolutely.
The only thing is, would it be beneficial for the city to kind of put it on the radar that this is something that we have to address, so when Highway 5 does get rebuilt, the state realizes you have a real concern, and maybe you can get some funding to do a crosswalk or a tunnel. If you show it's a concern now, rather than when they come along and say, okay, we're going to build this, well, we didn't know your wish list. That's the only thing.
Well, and I think the unknown comes from people not being able to visualize how wide are the lanes? Are there big wide shoulders? Are you suddenly trying to put a ditch down the middle of the road on the extreme case? I have the benefit of having a corridor study that we did in 2008 on my desk that I've looked at a million times for what that section potentially looks like. But the devil's in the details in terms of what those lane widths are. And I do think it's important to highlight it through this process as being something that needs to be planned and addressed and thought about. Because when you think about how many people walk back and forth for all of our events, if you're suddenly trying to run across 4 lanes of traffic without an actually safe crossing, it would be heartbreaking to be here when that happened.
Would it be possible to suppress 500?
You're gonna do a land bridge? Is that what you're saying?
It's just money.
The amount of extra land it takes in order to do an underpass is huge. I don't know. It's an ideal, isn't it?
I'm speculating that we should duly note it in our plan, but I'm also guessing it's not going to get done before we get to do this again, but the process might start between now and then.
Right.
Well, that's kind of where we left it at our last
Right.
steering committee. I mean, we just, I think Brad was gonna come up with some great language, that says we're aware of it. And we're, as we have to walk across it now, and we're gonna make sure we do a better job about it. And we're on it.
Yeah. Crossings need to be planned for, paid for, invested in,
Yep.
overpass, underpass.
Some sort of solution.
And 50% of that walking traffic, at least 50, maybe 70% is people parking on my street and all the streets around me. Then they have to cross because there's no parking.
Right,
down
it's
there.
the one food
You know what I mean?
Wednesday night car night.
That's the
Right,
devil, isn't it? I mean,
There's no
that's what it
parking.
is.
Right.
That's the bear. So that, if we're not gonna address the parking issue downtown, then we better plan on a tunnel.
Remember, Haz, we're going to all about parking in September.
Yeah, what's
They're going
that?
to have it all figured out. Right?
You need some underground.
Well, it sounds like it is being,
Being
it's
looked
being,
at.
yeah, and it sounds like it's gonna be over here, and if it works out the way it is, with not the flat ramp, but, the way with our elevation changes, we're gonna be, it's gonna be a challenge, but it sounds like it might work out really well. That would be great.
Yeah, the parking study will, from my viewpoint, go a long way in creating some facts for us to operate off of, reviewing what the existing conditions are and what the projected conditions are as redevelopment continues to help the city make informed decisions about how and where to invest.
It'd be nice.
Yeah. Do you get to work on that, Rita?
No, if there's someone that really loves parking. You get to do it.
Do you think you need any more feedback on that?
No.
Topic?
No, that was great. I made some notes. He'll have to read them.
You can always watch it back.
Yeah, no, I'm just.
Tell him you spilled coffee on your notes. The group, I think we have actually covered the topics that the group covered, unless you have
I don't have any other notes.
any other notes. This solar resource protection element is required. Don't know if you want to say anything about, if anybody had any questions about that, or if Rita wants to say anything about it. All I can tell you is it's required.
I can answer a question, but it's required.
Can I just, outside of this scope, which I don't mean to take us off track, but I'm going to just for a minute, what are you seeing market-wide of this whole solar thing that was crazy for a while, is still growing, is still a big trend? As we go west in the community, western Carver County, you see more and more solar fields every day. Is that something your organization sees ongoing?
So far, the marketplace still seems to be going. Obviously, there's going to be impacts based on tariffs and federal taxes that are going to influence some of that, and also But it is something that we're still dealing with and trying to address. Some communities are addressing it much more strongly than others. It depends upon the combination of interest in solar and land for solar. So and those two factors aren't always coexisting. Sometimes it's one, sometimes it's the other. So some people have plenty of land but don't like the idea of solar, so they're not doing it. Some people don't really have land but like solar, so they're doing it in kind of the urban method. And some cities have both. So it really kind of depends. But
I just foresee it's something we're going to have to deal with at some point.
You're gonna see it coming down the line here. I sit on some of the conferences for all the energy stuff for mechanical and plumbing. And state of California, year 2020, everybody has to have some of their power delivered to a residence or any other building by solar power.
50%.
Alternate mount, yeah, it depends on the building and
Yeah.
the, square footage, and there's other ways to do it, lights that automatically go off, half the outlets die in a building, so you don't have, ghost stuff, but there's a lot of ways to do it, and 2020, California's, that's it, so.
That's why I brought it up. We're going to be seeing it sooner versus later, I think, because our group at some point with the stuff we're seeing in our community already here, our county.
Any other questions on the land use section? And I'm not intending to spend as much time on any other section except for sanitary sewer.
Your favorite.
I've got you sitting here, you're gonna have to talk about it. Okay. Oh,
We trust you've reviewed it extensively. That's why.
it is important to have said that the section includes goals, policies, and actions. So there's more than just data. There's actual actions planned that then will become the framework for the implementation plan that's still under development.
Kara, can I ask a question? Maybe you can answer, but maybe you can answer as well. I suspect there's a fair amount of either policies or actions that will require then action on behalf of the city and the council and the commission to revise ordinances. Is that part of HKGI's services in terms of, is your team familiar enough with our ordinances to be able to make suggestions about what it is that we should be changing? Or is that something that city staff takes on, sort of a comprehensive review to find, okay, now here's what's recommended, now what do we got to do about it?
I would say it's a bit of a financial decision. So last time we got through the comprehensive plan, we were in the recession. We eliminated the planner position, so we only had a community development director position, and we attempted to do the ordinance updates on our own as we went, and then it would get busy and the work wouldn't get done. I do think it makes a lot of sense to, with HKGI working on all the other ordinance work that they're now helping the city with, to try to prioritize getting the rest of that work completed is once the plan's adopted. So it might be something we have to budget for, whether we need to think about budgeting for some of that in next year's budget. The plan will get approved theoretically in, the first or second quarter of next year. If they could start working on, if we had money budgeted to work on some of that stuff, that certainly would be something I'd be recommending to the community development director when they get here, if we can find the money to do it. I mean, some of you were around for that lengthy, Holly would get through some of the ordinances and then other priorities would come up. And the shoreline ordinance, somebody's been trying to write in the entire 20 years I've been working here. Mm-hmm. So it's good to hear it's on an agenda and gonna get finalized, because
No. We're not getting finalized now.
but at some day it'll get finalized
Just
versus
wanna lower the expectation.
every new community development director who comes on board is like, wait, your shoreline ordinance is wrong. So that's my answer. I don't know if you have anything to add.
I can tell you a typical answer if that helps in context for a comprehensive plan. So normally, the comprehensive plan is done in its entirety. As part of that, we may highlight elements that we think need to be updated, but the details of exactly what gets updated and how you tweak it don't come until after as part of the implementation. Kind of back to that 10,000 foot level, you'll never dive deep enough to really know all of the ins and outs. The implementation chapter will talk more in generalities about, for example, the fact that we need to make sure if we change a land use category, that the zoning districts will need to make sure that they comply. And that's kind of a follow-up step to any comprehensive plan. So generally, our services are to develop the plan, and then the next steps are to work through the ordinances. We might identify where some of those changes need to be, but not the details of exactly how it might get changed. And that's the case for most communities on how you kind of work through the process. So generally next year, at the end of next year, once those plans get adopted till the following few years, is when cities either internally do it or start bringing on staff consultants to help work through those elements, to bring
Yeah.
those things out.
So you create the roadmap of what needs to get addressed.
Right, so, yes, and, you know, being that we have staff that are working with your ordinances and working with you, it'll be a little bit different of a case. So some communities, you know, we go in and we help them, but we don't dive into their zoning ordinance enough, which makes it tough for us to know exactly where some of the hiccups might be. Cities where we're the staff planners, or that changes the dynamic, and we're able to better articulate where we think those hiccups are gonna be, or where we think changes are gonna need to be made. So it really differs for us from community to community, how we can articulate and how much depth we can provide about where changes might need to happen. But again, the comp plan is supposed to be more general. You don't want to be too prescriptive, because sometimes once you go in to make ordinance changes, you start to look at things slightly different, and you might want to make a little adjustment. And if you don't want to be too prescriptive so that you have to make any change to the comp plan to make those adjustments that you need to the zoning ordinance.
It'll probably depend on how fast the city wants to do all that, because they probably won't have the staff available to sit down and just do some of the ordinances while they're handling the day-to-day planning. So it'll be a priority thing to bring in consultants as you need to get it done.
Yeah, and I just think it is important to say that, because you look at all these policies and actions, and they require work. So if you want to realize the results of the comprehensive plan, you have to commit the resources to the implementation chapter in order to implement it.
Yeah, so just as an example, having some of us have been around long enough where it was just recently after the last comprehensive plan was done, you cite the example of, you know, Holly going through ordinance. I remember that at that time she was trying to address the ordinances. They'd get set aside when developments came through, but steadily trying to address the ordinances. But in the meantime, what I found was that it put some pressure on the planning commission, because as you're reviewing proposals for developments and the ordinances haven't been updated for many years, you're left trying to balance the aspirational goals of the comprehensive plan document that aren't necessarily in alignment with your ordinances, right? And so always navigating the spirit of the intent and where the vision now lies, which is likely different from a 20-year-old ordinance that, you know, should have been updated, but that's what's on the books right now. But it just puts pressure on, I think, the city staff and the commission to sort of balance those goals.
I think that's part of the reason we reverted to PUDs instead of straight ordinances, or straight zoning for a few years. It seemed like a more applicable thing.
That probably is at the core of it, because at that time when we were very heavily weighted towards PUDs, it allowed for all the aspirations and the goals and to kind of come into play without having it prescriptively written out in a way. And that was creating some confusion, as, you know, developers weren't sure what the rules were, because the rules were actually sort of changing somewhat through this document, as well as, you know, behind the scenes work on the ordinances. And that made the PUD process a better means of communication, I think.
Mm-hmm, definitely.
And we're not gonna be able to hire planners probably with the expertise that some of your consultants have, because they've gone through ordinances, where the young planner coming in is not gonna have that expertise.
Mm-hmm.
Is it the type of thing that a summer intern could do?
And that's
college- a
exactly
student-
some way you couldn't do it.
You couldn't,
I'm saying,
because
you
they're
try to
not
write an
familiar.
ordinance, it's difficult,
Okay,
yeah.
They could,
It's fairly technical and convoluted. Right now, we have, as you know, we have 2 consultant planners working for the city, and we have the pleasure of watching them dialogue through how the ordinance applies to a certain situation that rises, and you've got 2 experienced people debating over what the words mean, and I think I am so glad I'm not a planner.
Engineers just go straight.
Got a right answer.
Black or white.
Back to sewer, it goes downhill.
what I was envisioning was a two-step process. Identifying something is one thing, and writing it is another. Different expertise.
Certainly, there would be a role for interns to help us out.
Exact, that's what-
I don't deny that.
Might be cheaper.
So yeah, there's just a bunch of policies, and then that brings us to the economic development section. We talked about this section quite a bit. People just found it interesting, some of the elements related to economic development and what it means. Did Brad know anything we're supposed to ask on this section?
No, he didn't talk about that.
Any commissioners have any questions that came up from this section when you were reviewing it? Or steering committee members that want to add anything?
I just think,
Finance handle it. I think it's an extremely important thing that this city needs to make sure that we do develop a tax base.
yeah, that's the biggest problem I think we have is trying to attract somebody here is because it's hard to get in and out if you have any size vehicle, truck-wise, or infrastructure we don't have for industrial. I mean, what we have here is what we're gonna get. It's gonna be a smaller type retail, boutique, a salon type. That's just what our downtown is. It's not Chanhassen, it's not Waukegan. We don't have room for a Target here. If we did, it would have to go out there, then we're talking
In the
infrastructure.
downtown, but
Yeah,
in your area that you have to the south. there.
South.
right,
The
so,
future nodes allows for that, but today, to Todd's point,
and definitely, yeah.
111.
So it's,
Or 10, excuse me.
and that was supposed to be our commerce corridor anyway, was 10 and 212. The traffic, we were gonna have no traffic on Highway 5 when they built those. I went to 3 meetings where they told me that. But that never happens.
Oops. Then, moving on would be the housing section, which Doug found interesting. I think this was the section where you were reflecting on the age of it's kind of a telling picture, the age of our housing stock. Other than we noted that this built 2010 or later is out of date, since it only says we've built 130 housing units since 2010 or later, but,
last year.
It's in my backyard.
you know, 42.6% of it coming in 2000 to 2009. Interestingly enough, this chart correlates to the age of your infrastructure. So the same elements that are discussed in here about as the housing stock ages, making sure there's the ability to improve your house as it starts to deteriorate is the same thing we have to do with infrastructure. Anything else you want to say about that section?
No.
All right. So parks, recreation, open space, and natural resources. The Park and Rec Committee has reviewed this section. They got an earlier snapshot than everyone else.
We're changing that picture. That needs to go.
It's beautiful. Does look like a deteriorated covered bridge or something. That is an actual park.
It is.
Been there,
It needs to do a little weed whipping around there, please.
the end of our bike trail.
The steering committee noted to review and make sure policy and action items reference partnerships with schools for shared facilities and programming opportunities, so that the notion that we generally like that model and would want to see that incorporated into the plan. I think this group, when I went back through the presentation from the last joint meeting, we did talk quite a bit about the parks and open space section and the notion of the green ribbon. The priority all of us are well aware of connecting the trail gaps. Came out again in our latest community survey that continues to need to be a priority to get those trail connections made. Lot of conversation around the concept of a new waterfront park in Pearson. So I don't know where all these maps are in here, so I have to annoyingly tab through them. This map shows the trail gaps in big bright red, in case you missed it. Some pretty important pieces to create final connectivity that doesn't exist today, which is, I get calls about all the time. When are you making that trail connection? And that's an area that requires financial commitment. Those trail gaps that remain are not going to happen through development. They're going to have to happen through grant dollars, and most of those grant funds require local match. So the city council recently created a new trail fund to start trying to set aside some money that can be seed money for that, in recognition of this needing to be a priority.
Is there a generalized number that costs per foot or per 100 feet of trail? Or is it just, or our topography so different that every area is going to be different? Or do you have a general base idea of how much 100 feet costs for a trail?
I don't have 100 feet off the top of my head, but Ann has a number for all these trail gaps.
Okay.
So she's done some of that benchmarking work, and we did some specific estimates on some of the corridors that she then used to extrapolate out. So I don't know that number off the top of my head.
What she was telling me today was the ones that are left are quite complex and expensive.
That's why they're not done.
Yeah.
Is this something that our park dedication fees can be used towards?
You could use park dedication fees for that, from my understanding.
Right now, the park dedication fees we're getting are going to build out the parks in the neighborhoods that we're building. And that was part of the discussion, I think, with the city council. It was, we need to be setting aside some of this money for that purpose. And I think that's coming through the general fund, actually.
Yeah, I think you put aside 50,000 this year for trails. I think next year's budget right now is like 150,000 we're supposed to put away, but that still doesn't build much.
The good news is for a lot of those bigger trail corridors, there is grant opportunity, but the last application that staff had brought to the city council a couple of years ago, the city didn't have any matching funds, so the council declined to apply for the grant. So I do think part of the thought of having some of that money available is it makes it more comfortable to pursue grant funds.
Just some feedback on the Greenway concept. I feel like a Greenway ribbon concept is an amazing aspirational goal, but the challenge is that it will never be complete for 20 to 30 years. Right? And so even though it looks nice and we can get excited about it, it's so long term that in the interim, it feels like there's merits to the concept. And I wonder if there shouldn't be some equal energy around interim solutions. You know, a smaller belt that's actually connected that we can talk about and advertise. And maybe that's what it is for the next 10 years, but then it's a little bit bigger, or, you know, like what's the interim interconnectivity that we can, you know, get our community excited about because we can make it happen. And yes, in the future, maybe a part of that is, you know, a part of what the ultimate vision is for the Greenway. But over time, then, as these developments to the west and the south fill in, and you ultimately get there, because it doesn't feel like there'll be the energy necessary to make it a reality sooner rather than later. It's gonna come with a significant amount of development in both directions. But I think everybody agrees that the idea is really strong.
There have been cities in the metro area that have passed pretty good-sized bond issues to just do some things like that. You know, it's a hard sell, but it's.
Yeah, start small, start with something achievable, get excited about it, use it, and then as you can expand upon it as development occurs and the actual route of the greenway may change, but there's always like a closed loop that can be clearly understood, communicated, celebrated.
Actually loop and not end at a dead end.
Right. The loop is key, right? Because that's what you can talk about. That's very different from a trail that takes you to a dead end. I mean,
Then you turn around and come
right.
back.
There's something about the loop that you always know you can close that loop, whatever, whether you're walking, biking, whatever it is, and how you connect and where you connect to that loop is sort of your own business. But getting to the loop and being able to talk about that as an idea, I think has a lot of value.
So as we're looking at prioritizing the trail gaps, you prioritize the closing of the loops as a priority instead of
Yeah.
some other way you might prioritize them.
Define a loop that's achievable. It probably doesn't exist today, but you define what it would take to achieve that in a way that then you can communicate around it and celebrate it and advertise. And it's not what this is going to be, but it might be a part of it. It might, aspects of what the ultimate vision is contributing to it. And so that's something that sort of gets enriched with time as development occurs and you can expand upon a really strong idea.
Now, loops are what, I used to be a runner, and I used to get out to Minneapolis and run around the lakes because they were all loops. Whereas Minnetonka didn't have that, so the loop is the thing.
And
Why
Minneapolis
do
would have
people
been-
run around Lake Calhoun all day long, right? And there's just something about a defined loop that you can clearly understand, you can get to from a variety of points.
You don't feel like you're undoing your work at a dead end and running back.
There's something about it. Yep.
Yeah, you can try and go faster on the way back.
But I feel like adding that interim solution to this idea would, I think, help strengthen the idea, but also make it achievable on a timeline that I think the city can get behind and help prioritize some things. Just some thoughts.
Yep, good thought.
Got all that?
Yeah, no, I understand.
I like it. Loop within a loop. Any other comments on this section? This is the location that was identified for that future park on Pearson. That moved around, I think, a little bit, but this is where it's landed based on feedback along the way. This is outside of our 2040 growth area, but if you're going to envision a park, you would want to start planning for it early. It's a long time before that's going to happen. And then, of course, the park on Wasserman is included in the document. Transportation and mobility. This is a section that I actually think we're probably going to cut some of the information out of it that is maybe not terribly useful or somewhat redundant to what's happening in the county's transportation plan. Victoria is a bit unique because we have so many roads that are county and state. That's where our capacity is. Most of our local roads are carrying much less traffic. So our plan is informed greatly by the county and state plan. the county's plan, more importantly. So what our focus needs to be on is advocating for resources and prioritization for these external improvements that need to happen. So making sure that we keep those priorities in front of us, are advocating with the county when it's appropriate, starting to pursue funds for intersections that need to be upgraded. The reality of funding and transportation is that it goes to the people who seek it. So you have to be in front of it and actively engaged and spending time and resources to actually see anything happen. With the Carver County tax being in place, that's ever more important. There's a ton of need for those dollars, and the county is going to go where they're wanted and where they're seen willing partners. So I see transportation as being a key priority for the city council over the next 5 years, particularly as development has picked back up. You all hear the traffic complaints when the plats come in for approval. To see those roadways upgraded is something that we're gonna have to continue to focus as a priority. And with that, I'd answer any questions you might have. But a lot of this stuff is standards.
Carrie, you were mentioning that park development on the west side of Pearson. And the timing of it in terms of, thinking about it sooner rather than later, it seems appropriate because while the neighborhood parks that are outlined always seem to sort of come either with development or oftentimes after development, it seems like a community park of that order of magnitude could actually need to happen sooner and then spur development, right? Because it's an attraction and would likely then lead to development in the region around it. But it would take a tremendous amount of energy and financial backing of the city to sort of lead the way.
Right. You'd be purchasing it ahead of time.
Yeah, we usually get the dedication, but you're right.
Right, but for a park of this scale, it would likely be necessarily different. And in some ways, it's like an investment in the community in terms of leading the way, seeing the value, developing it, knowing that the homes and the development near and around it are to come later, as opposed to, that's very different from the neighborhood parks that, it all sort of comes hand in hand and typically comes with land dedication and partnership with developers.
Put that on the same bond issue you do the trails on.
Well, let's separate them because otherwise it may never happen.
If there are no questions on transportation, we can move right along. Traffic is increasing with development.
Bodies.
Yep. The next section is the surface water management plan. It's fair to say that this section had the least amount of work completed before it was released for draft. So I need to do a little bit of work on this section. And we'll be looking to the watershed district to see if they have any comments. We want to make sure that we're incorporating some of the work that's been completed to date. But this section has pretty specific requirements in terms of what we are required to have in it. So it's a required element of the plan. Surface water management and water resources are and will continue to be a priority of the city. And we're fairly lucky, from my view, in terms of the relationship that we've been able to, the partnership, I should say, we've been able to develop with Minnehaha Creek in terms of bringing their technical resources to the table and working in partnership on things compared to how we used to be working against each other. That wasn't terribly fun.
Kara, my sense is that your attitude along with the city's attitude around surface water management is evolving. So is this the section where you intend to capture some of that and articulate the, the shift to more regional treatment of water as opposed to what we've been doing for, seems like a while?
Well, we had that language in our existing plan, but what we're lacking is the tool to implement it. So we had the aspirational goal to regionalize, but now that we're getting these 40-acre, 20-acre subdivisions, 40-acre subdivisions coming in these little phases through straight zoning, it's much more difficult to say, go build this regional pond here today. So through some of these other discussions, figuring out how to make sure we have a tool to allow us to do that will be really important. But we do certainly want to make sure that language is strong here. We need to recognize the formation of we don't know the name of it yet, but Water Quality Committee in this section, and just update it to be a little bit more reflective of today's circumstances. A lot of this language came out of the old plan.
So what's an example of a tool? Is it something in the ordinances, or is it like a city policy in terms of investment and infrastructure? Like, not what is the tool, but like, what are some examples of tools that you're thinking about to like make a regional stormwater?
Yep, that's the question I'm asking everyone, is what do we need to do in order to make that happen? Some of it can be around design standards, where we could say the minimum pond size shall be no smaller than X, to try to force a certain minimum pond size, which then will drive them into a boat of having to regionalize a little bit better. But what the watershed district is envisioning is maybe they go out, they acquire property, they do a wetland restoration project, they construct a regional stormwater pond ahead of development, and then turn around and sell the property that they don't need for the work they're looking to do, and then that investment's already there, and then everybody's just connecting to it, which would be fantastic from a infrastructure.
Is the addition of the regional pond, because the city takes all these in outlots, and we're talking maintenance. Lots of maintenance in these small ponds for cleaning them.
Correct.
Do we find less maintenance, or is it just easier to have a larger regional one area to access
Yeah.
overall?
It's an efficiency thing. If you've got to go to 70 of them versus 10 of them, it's Lake Town. The first phase of Lake Town went in with regional ponding because that whole thing was master planned. So even some of the current phases were accommodated through the original master plan. And so you see those large regional pond when you turn onto Red Fox to go to the school, there's a big pond. We don't see those anymore. We get these little things that.
So what spurs that, 300 acres, a development size, as opposed to 30,
Yeah,
40?
exactly.
Yeah, okay.
So, yeah, I don't know what all the tools are, but we need to figure them out.
This park that you're planning on the western edge, could the focal point be such a pond? In other words, build it there?
Potentially. Through the western area, they're identifying all the subwatersheds and figuring out where the optimal location would be for gravity, so that you can serve the largest area using a pipe that doesn't get too deep. Because you'd prefer to not have your storm sewer pipe 30 feet deep.
Sure.
From an expense perspective. And then the last section, which is by far the greatest section in the whole plan,
Saving it for last.
talks about community facilities. We think Doug and I, our opinion is we're maybe missing something related to community facilities in this section. For one, we missed the public works facility, so, but just a discussion around whether there's a desire for any other types of community spaces, community facilities, community center,
I think a huge one is we're missing an event center.
right?
I mean, we're adding one at Lions Field, the Lions are, but it's not quite big enough. It's there, but we need something that's an event center, so people don't have to go to another community for a 250-person wedding. We have no place where we can have someone come in and cook food, rent the kitchen. The one up there is nondescript. We need something like that going forward, a plan for that and a location with parking that works for larger groups instead of small groups.
Like the parking lot we have at Lions now.
What's that?
Like the parking lot we have at Lions.
Yeah. Yeah, the dirt one is perfect.
Going there today, I'd never been on it. I thought I was gonna lose my car.
And you can, right now, we can easily sit 200 people in that new spot up there, but once again, no kitchen, and that first parking lot is fine, but it's too small, and the dirt one's dirt. Come a rainstorm, if someone's in a wheelchair, we have no handicap parking for them to access that building, so things like that, something that's a complete event center.
Pearson Lake.
There you go.
And then the next two sections are the sanitary sewer and water system sections. I don't intend to talk about those, despite my kidding aside, but
Come on, I was a plumber for 30 years, fill me in a little.
certainly can answer any questions. The infrastructure elements are boring, but they're the most important part of this process. You can land use plan all you want, but if I don't know about it and can't make sure your sewer pipes are big enough, you won't be able to implement the growth that's laid out in the infrastructure plan. The thing to note with infrastructure planning is it's extremely long range. So this map is showing our existing sanitary sewer system. And this reddish, orangish trunk sewer line is a large diameter line that we started putting in 2003 because we were working at the comprehensive plan at the same time and realized that a development that was coming in called Watermark was about to cut off our only route to the regional sewer system. So we had to quick stop the presses, design a pipe 30 inches in diameter and get it in the ground with development. So what that also speaks to is that when you get down to this area, one of the things I had to watch out for was if, for example, the planning team decided that this wasn't going to be single family anymore, it was going to be all 8-story apartment buildings with 60 units per acre on it, the pipes wouldn't be big enough and we wouldn't be able to serve it. So it's boring, but I have to make my case that it's really important. And then certainly with drinking water,
And as far as our flow goes, obviously tons of lift stations. I mean, with our topography, we're gonna be, we have lift stations, that's just normal, any community-wise, but it flows to the north, doesn't it? And then the quarters down Highway 7, or the collection areas?
correct.
Yeah,
So our system flows to a Met Council interceptor that runs through Victoria. If you recall, Met Council made a significant investment in the system, 2010, 11, 12, with the construction of 3 large diameter tunnels under the city to handle our projected growth, Waconia's projected growth, and points west. But yes, all of our flow then heads up into a lift station in Minnetrista, in Shorewood, and eventually off to the Blue Lake wastewater treatment plant.
way down in Shakopee.
Yeah, all the way to Shakopee. The water system will also need to expand to accommodate growth. The city council's been talking about the water main expansion for quite some time. So if and when Mr. Geshtak decides to develop his property, the map isn't in here yet. His property south of Marsh Lake Road, we are going to need one additional well, but ultimately we'll end up with several additional wells and an additional water treatment plant in the south part of the city to serve the growth area.
So when we develop Cheval, our half or our sliver of it. There was talk of, I don't remember exactly what ended up happening, but of interconnection with Chaska. Did that happen there?
So we are interconnected with Chaska, so in an emergency situation, we could have access to water. The problem is their system pressure is very different than ours, so it wouldn't be something that we could access it in an emergency, but we couldn't use it for prolonged use because
Gotcha.
their pressure's
Demand.
too high.
And then also, there's a water quality issue in between each city too.
Correct.
We should be protective of our resource if we're the ones treating it in this city.
Correct.
Being proactive that way.
We have an interconnect with Shorewood, and they don't treat for iron and manganese removal, so we have used that interconnect at times, so then the people up in that area are getting water that isn't treated to the same level of ours, which it's not a health concern, it's just an aesthetic taste.
Aesthetic and the quality and duration of the pipe you're putting in, so.
Yeah. Okay, so with that, I'm gonna go back to my presentation that was provided and make sure we covered everything we were supposed to, if I can figure out how to zoom out. So I do think we touched on the main issues that came out of the steering committee. I was going through Brad's memo as we walked through it, so I do think we covered everything that is on here. And so then that just brings us back to our remaining schedules. So the Planning Commission isn't being asked to provide a recommendation for approval. Certainly if you wanted a head nod that you're comfortable with releasing it for jurisdictional review based on the work that's completed to date, we would share that feedback with the City Council. But again, you're not being asked to approve anything, and this is our schedule going forward. So even if you have additional comments after tonight, or as you continue to review the plan, either between now and the City Council meeting or June, certainly that feedback would certainly still be welcomed by our team. Do you think I have anything else I'm supposed to say?
Looked like what was on the memo. I'll go back.
With that, I would take any questions, or we can move on.
I just want to say, I want to thank the people that served on that committee. I wish I could have been on it, but other commitments, but a lot of work gone into it, and that was a commitment, and I appreciate you guys doing that, who served on that, so. I mean, to me, to absorb it over the month I've had it to absorb, I haven't even scratched what they've done, so I appreciate that very much.
I think it's impressive how many people have been involved in this process. I mean, you touched on it a little bit. I appreciate that summary in the document in terms of the public engagement and various stakeholders throughout the community. It's
It's been fun,
been pretty cool.
educational.
Brought Scott right up here to the Planning Commission. All right, with that then, I'm gonna stop talking and
Great job.
Good job.
thanks.
So any other feedback on comprehensive plan? Otherwise, we'll move on. All right, so the next item on the agenda is the council meeting update, but the last council meeting was canceled, so I don't think we've got anything to report on, correct? So next item is miscellaneous. Does anybody have anything?
Chairman, I have a couple things.
Sure.
Community Development Director, we are interviewing on Friday. We had 22 applications. We're interviewing 6 people. I think there's some good people in that thing, so unfortunately, some of them are not living in the state of Minnesota at this time, so it might take a while to get them here. But I'm optimistic that we'll be narrowing it down on Friday and moving forward. Secondly, you're going to talk about the shoreline ordinance when?
The second meeting in June.
Second meeting in June.
I'll be back. I'm actually the person working on the shoreline, so
If-
that's one of the reasons. tonight.
If you're okay with it, I'd like to ask this new lake quality, whatever that committee's name is, to come and listen to that presentation because they're going to be into the shoreline. Does that work for you? Just not to be up there, but just to be part of that meeting and listen to what she's going to present?
Yeah. I
Because
think-
they're interested and they've asked about it. and we're not in a position to tell them anything about it yet because we don't have it.
Yeah.
Mr. Reader, another question on miscellaneous. How did the council perceive the alternate planning commission members? Did that get presented to them?
They agreed to move forward with that, and we had set the interviews for this Monday, which didn't happen. So we'll be interviewing, and they'll be adding 2 alternate members, you know. And they're gonna go back, there's 2 people that were not in the original pack that they want to interview, and then they're gonna consider all the ones that had applied and select 2. And there'll be one will be ahead of the other, so that if there's a chair, the one person goes before the other person. And that the idea would be that they would not sit up here, but would be back here in the audience and watch what you do and learn from you, and then when they have the chance to get up here. So,
Thank you.
And I still have.
Yeah.
So your June 5th Planning Commission meeting has been canceled. So that is off there. And so the next one will be for the 19th. There was nothing on the agenda. So that is that. And then the next one is the emails. So we did get approval, Doug approved that for the Planning Commission members to get an email address. So I'll work with each of you to get it. We usually just have the first initial and then your last name, and then at ci.victoria.mn.us. I think, and that's what I have.
What happened to the chicken ordinance?
No time, staff turnover. It's not,
It's what,
staff turnover, not a high priority right now.
this was sort of my first open-ended thing that came on here.
I'm gonna have to call mine pets.
Mary Jo, you beat me to it. I was gonna bring it back because Mr. Jones wants to know about his chicken coop, so we should probably address it at some point.
You've gotten a question from the,
Jones, just Mr.
Oh.
Jones has reached out to all of us a couple of times
Oh.
looking for some direction for his chicken coop.
I
Frankly, If we don't approve it soon enough, the chickens won't lay.
I got 3 neighbors too just hounding me about it. I thought that was coming up.
Mr. Jones is aka Mr. Treathart. He just calling it an alias through these emails.
I did respond to him and let him know our status and connected him with city staff, so.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
And another miscellaneous item, because you just reminded me, it's, and I don't think all of you were here last time, but we agreed at the last meeting that this is kind of based on the open meeting law. So whenever a resident reaches out to either any one of us or all of us, which often happens, at the last meeting we agreed that that I would respond.
Yep.
Or whoever the acting chair is, so that we don't find ourselves doing a reply all or, you know, providing background and, you know, we might be at risk with the open meeting law. But just for clarity, then we're not all responding to each other, you know, who's responding. I'll just be proactive and do my best to either redirect comments or questions to city staff or respond individually. But I likely would not reply all to, again, open meeting law.
yeah, and along with that, when you do get the, your email address, what it will be, if anybody does question one, it's going to the whole group. So that'll be on the website. So if people want to contact the Planning Commission, their solution builder said that it will go to all of you. So then again, then it's always the chair that will be responding instead of.
That'd be great. Thanks for doing that. And if you could just let us know that you have responded, if they keep reaching out to us. Is that
I
possible?
don't, only at the meeting. He
Okay.
could give you an update
Right.
probably.
or he could tell staff and staff could tell.
In this case, Jones just reached out to us a couple of times, and I don't want to respond in violation of whatever. That's why
Right.
they responded the way that they did. I don't know if that's appropriate or not, but
And one way, maybe when Jeff responds is on behalf of the Planning Commission,
Right.
then you give your report. But I think that it would be safer just to have Jeff report at the meetings instead of
I agree.
going through.
Yep.
Look, could I just ask, okay, so you send out the question to all of us.
I don't, when the person asks the question through the website, they'll get, when it says Planning Commission members or
We'll all
however,
get that.
yep, you'll all get it, but then Jeff would be the
And
responsible.
then we would respond only to Jeff if we have an opinion on that question.
No, we shouldn't be,
That's what I don't
so
understand.
You'd hold
we really shouldn't be interacting through email through
At all.
through resident requests or questions. I think the planning commission meeting is an open meeting, and that's intended. So whenever anybody reaches out to all of us or any of us individually, it really needs to primarily be referenced to city staff.
Okay.
I think it'd be rare that I would provide information to any one individual resident that wasn't in the context of an open meeting. So I would say that most often, 95% of the time, I would connect them with the appropriate city staff member so that it can either be responded to or dealt with appropriately or brought before the planning commission in a public forum.
So
That's
do
perfect.
that, as planning commissioners, it sounds like to me, you're just using the emails as reference, so you're up to date on what residents are saying and that you're all getting the same information.
Well,
So, right, so they're not responding. That's
Yeah.
how I would, it's like information, it's just one-way information to an individual person.
And for their packets and different stuff that the staff sends out to
Right.
them. Yep.
Right, but I was thinking of residents. The biggest thing is that you're not responding, you just
Mm-hmm.
know that someone did it so that you're not surprised when you come to the meeting and 10 people showed up because 10 people emailed. You actually get to know the fact that there's that much interest, but you're not doing anything about it.
Thank you.
Yeah, historically, it's been very rare for us as individual planning commissioners to be either contacted by residents or certainly even more rare to be actually exchanging ideas, either thoughts or opinions or ideas. It's really not appropriate to be happening through email. So I think when we talked last time about establishing a city email, the context was primarily because we all get emails and notifications from the city. Either we get our packets or we get notifications that a meeting time has changed or been canceled. And creating a city email avoids having our either personal emails or business emails subject to data requests by the public. And I think a secondary benefit to having city emails is that I guess now you're saying that there can be a link on the website for someone to submit an inquiry. But I wouldn't expect that the inquiries would go up because of that, and if they did, it would just be me connecting them with city staff.
Yep.
Does that all make sense?
Yeah. In other words, hit the delete button once you read it, because you're not going to respond to it.
Right.
And it's going to be brought forward by staff if they find it something we should be discussing.
I think
Basically.
that's what I appreciated about the clarity last week, is that rather than all of us wondering, we feel obliged to our community
Right.
and our residents to not be non-responsive, but I think as chair, we agreed that I should take the responsibility and representation of the committee, just acknowledging receipt of it and that either making the connection so that there isn't that ambiguity. I think if any of you felt personally obliged, I would say at the most you could reply and say that, that the commission chair will respond appropriately. Because I know how each of you don't want to go silent and, I could be traveling, but I think the reality is I just have to, knowing that this is the protocol set up, I have to take that on to be responsive as a representative of our body, and I agree to do that.
And I think I can put that on the website too, that only the chair will be responding if they ask a question,
That seems
if they
reasonable.
read that or not, but that,
It manages expectations so that
Yep.
no one feels personally, obliged or like they're letting people down by being non-responsive.
We know when all this will be done.
I'll be contacting you probably within the week.
Thank you. And you said the planning commission, what was canceled? Which one?
June 5th,
That's canceled?
yep.
Thank you.
I will not be here the first one of July or the middle one in June.
So you'll want to share that email with city staff?
Yeah,
I should email
Probably Laura,
you. Okay,
because Laura keeps track of our attendance for, make
Okay.
sure we have a quorum,
Or me,
or,
yeah,
I'll just-
just because of the staff turnover that may be happening, both of us. So you said the first two, the July ones?
I'll be here, the second one in July, I think I'll be here.
And so Cindy, that's a good reminder, I guess, for all of us on the commission, that if we're unable to attend, we should just send a quick email to, I guess, both you and Laura.
Yeah, that would
For
be
now.
helpful for now.
Yeah, and this, it will be equally important when we get alternate council or commission members in the audience, because then we can plan when that is in place, when they might step up and take your seat while you're gone to be an active commissioner for that evening. Anything else under miscellaneous?
Cindy, if you could send your contact information, that'd be great, and get it in my database. Thank you.
Otherwise, I move that we adjourn. Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Have a good evening.
Which part?
That was good.
It's fun.
What's that?
Fun document to read.
You want to copy the comp plan?